Okie doke. Okay, we should be live. I don't know if anyone is watching or if anyone's here yet, but I think we're good to go. I think, yeah. Anyway, yeah, first of all, if you're listening in, thank you very much for joining. Obviously, being a bit kind of later on a Saturday night, I don't know how many people will be around, but yeah, I mean, basically, I just want to talk about some of the kind of Charlie Kirk stuff and the response to it. And I want to kind of like gravitate or kind of reflect that out and then kind of like bring in a few other things in relation to it, like, the whole presidency thing, like the response that these people are going to have to future events. Because ultimately, what I'm going to try and do here is I'm not necessarily going to focus in on the Charlie Kirk stuff as much. I kind of really just want to get into kind of the reaction to it, if that kind of makes sense. So I'll go through a few things. We'll take a look at some articles here and there, and then we'll kind of finish up on a few different bits. So ultimately, like where do we want to go with this, or where do I want to start with this? Or, well, first of all, just to kind of like have a kind of a heads up, like this is not really going to be about the details of what happened, in terms of like the assassin and the individual that was arrested and all of that. I'm not really going to go into that per se. I'm just going to kind of focus in more on the reaction to all these different events and what's been the reaction from kind of like different kinds of leftists, what's been the reaction from normal people, what's been the reaction from Dublin 4 people, all that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to wrap that around. So, I mean, I suppose kind of like as a starting point to all of this, one of the things I find really, really fascinating, well, not really fascinating, is I suppose like one of the big things that's come out of this is that we've seen the kind of, among a certain percentage of people, that the reactions to what's happened has been absolutely, like people basically celebrating what happened. And, for me anyway, it kind of almost goes without saying that, like, if something like this happens, a man, a political content creator guy, he gets shot in a brutal way in broad daylight in front of his family, you know, whether you're left wing or right wing or whatever your opinion is, that's a vile, horrible, disgusting thing to happen. And it's just really interesting and horrifying at the same time, just to see the reaction to all these different people to this event, right? In particular, I mean, like, people have been sharing around various. The thing is, with all of this, right, is that there definitely is a trend here. And I mean a trend in two ways. First of all, I need to be a bit careful with my words here. I don't know how the YouTube algorithm works. I mean, it used to work like this back in the day during the lockdowns, but in 2021, when I'll just use that phrase from Thomas Sheridan, the needlecraft, right? When the needlecraft was being pushed on people, right? A lot of us obviously didn't get it or didn't want it. And, my attitude at the time was like, I mean, if anyone was following me kind of back then, I was doing stuff on, I was creating graphs and like data from RIP.ie, and I was kind of saying to people like, maybe you don't want to take this thing. It's not a good idea, right? But the response to that among a segment of the population was essentially like, yeah, for the unvaccinated, we need to think of ways to, and there were politicians who said this, there were journalists who said this, there were all sorts of people that said this. But I'll get on to the second part of what I mean by trends here. There are people basically saying that, like, if you don't get the vaccine, you should not be allowed into a supermarket to buy food. Like, if you're kind of shocked at this, I mean, it is shocking. But what I'm trying to say, for one thing, is that there is this trend. Like it's been there for a while, and it's popped up in a load of different places. But the first time I kind of really came into kind of into face to face with it was, during 2021. There are people, I mean, I might be able to just share my screen briefly here if I can just um see. I've got a new layout thing here. I'm kind of half reluctant to share the screen, but I just don't want to crash anything. But ultimately, my point being is, if you go back and just Google this for yourself, I have the article up in front of me, and this is a very famous article or headline from 2021, and the headline is from the Irish Daily Mail: Minister declares war on the unvaccinated. You know, like I said, loads of people, myself included, were just like, you want to take it, go for it. I just want to be left alone. I don't really want to take it. And the reaction to a percentage of the population, the same one that's doing this right now, is, oh, no, we want you to not be allowed to buy food in the supermarket. Incredible. Incredible stuff. So that's the first part of the trend, which has been kind of coming out of this. And then the second part of this as well has been ultimately this sort of like, I mean, I'll give an example, right? I've been in a few different, you know, like anyone here, like I have different interests, different groups, right? I'm into like, books and sport and computer games and, all sorts of things, like, and both kind of just in kind of my normal day to day kind of groups, like your Facebook and your WhatsApp, and both kind of on Twitter and things like that. It's been very kind of interesting to look at who is responding and how they're responding. So ultimately speaking, like the people who have been celebrating this, right, in general, and just like they were calling, or a lot of them were calling for zero COVID, and the unvaccinated should not be allowed to buy food and whatnot, which is a vicious, cruel thing to do, obviously. But there's a number of commonalities, and one of them I've noticed, for example, and ultimately what this does is that it all goes back to things like social status, right? So I'll get into that in a bit, but okay, cool. TWK Ireland says good evening, and Saints and Scholars says good evening as well. Cheers. Cool. I assume that my sound must be somewhat good as well, so we can kind of move forward with that. That's perfect. Cheers, lads. But ultimately, what I was kind of going back to is the whole kind of social status thing. So when I was taking a look, right, at all these kind of different groups and responses and how people are responding, there are a number of commonalities between people who are kind of like saying it's a good thing, or saying it was, or they were celebrating it, or to kind of get into like the different layers of it. So for example, like, there were people who were delighted and celebrating this horrible, awful event that happened. But then there's a sort of a kind of a, it was almost kind of like a, how can we put it? Like, how can I put it? Kind of like a sort of like an intelligence ladder, right? So the first level would be outright celebrating it. And then the next level over that would be saying stuff like, well, he got shot, but, live by the sword, die by the sword, that kind of way. Or, well, I condemn time, the guy was an evil white supremacist who said bad things about, ethnic minorities, And then another level on top of that, which is increasingly some of the government and Fine Gael level, was, this is an atrocity. I condemn this. Now we're going to bring this back into Irish politicians and how Irish politicians have their own issues. So, when you kind of break down all those issues, I mean, ultimately, for me anyway, it doesn't even matter what his political opinions are, in a sense. It doesn't matter in a sense, like, or really, like, if the guy was like a massive left-wing communist, right? He was still a guy who just expressed his opinion, political influencer, political content creator, and he got shot for it, and that's awful and woeful. And any kind of attempt to excuse that in any sort of way is just, I mean, personally, like, I do think it's outrageous, right? But the commonality, which I still haven't mentioned, I'm going to go through that now, is ultimately, if you take a look at the what kind of people are applying. So, like, you have your social group, like some are doctors, or some are like, brickies, or whatever, like, all across the board, like, working class, upper middle class, blah blah blah, right? the main commonality of the people who have kind of talked in this way about the whole Charlie Kirk incident have essentially been people who disproportionately, from what I've seen, have public sector jobs, right? And disproportionately people in, sort of like journalist types, NGOs, teachers, that kind of thing. And people have been kind of like doing this thing on the internet, kind of going like, this person said this about, the Charlie Kirk incident, celebrating it. That group that I've listed off, I think, in my opinion, has been disproportionately coming up and represented. And it was the same during the lockdowns. It was the same kind of group of people. Now, again, I'm not saying all of them. I'm saying kind of on average, this is just a trend that I've noticed with all of this, right? So if we kind of break that trend down even further, why is this happening? Why is it coming from this group of people, in my opinion, right? And in my opinion, the main reason that this is happening is because of the way people look at and people have and people view social status, right? So, for example, and this is kind of a key point, because, while I condemn vile behavior, like, celebrating this in any shape or form, right? I think it's important to have like to see where other people are, that see where they're coming from is, pretty vile, right? And where a lot of this is coming from is this. So the commonality between those kind of positions and jobs and social status that I've listed off here, right? The commonality between them is that I think, and it's been something I've talked a lot in this channel before, social status is a major like driver of hold on one second. Let me just, yeah, okay, this is better. Social status is like a major driver. Again, sorry for the boomer tech stuff there. Is a major driver of kind of like human behavior, right? And there are different jobs with different occupations and different positions you can have in society, right? Whereby your social status is kind of deserved, right? So, and it's always kind of going to be what it's going to be. So, for example, what I mean by that is a doctor is always going to be someone who's high status, who's always going to be respected, and to some degree, acquires a high level of competence, hard work, intelligence, and so on, right? Whereas there are always going to be some jobs and positions and places in society which are always going to be seen as low status, like criminals, for example, right? Now, in between all that, like, so you'll have like jobs and you'll have positions in your society, like, could be whatever, could be accountants, could be carpenters, could be electricians, could be doctors, right? With those kind of jobs and with those occupations, the social status that's attributed to them is kind of authentic in a sense, right? And it's a lot of times those kind of roles and things like that are based a lot on competency, right? On being competent. What happens if you have something like, say, a journalist or an NGO worker or a public sector worker, right? Because the thing is with those jobs and those occupations is that the social status of those jobs is a lot more fragile. Like I said, if you're a good doctor, good doctors will be respected in 50 years' time. They were respected 50 years ago, and so on. Now, if you take something like a journalist, right? Journalists about 15, 20 years ago were highly respected people, right? Highly respected people. People looked up to them. People thought, oh, knowledgeable. This guy, will have a good, grasp or analysis of the situation. But what's happened over the past like 10 years, 5 years, and it's really kind of sped up recently, is for the average person, journalists are becoming increasingly low status people that the average person does not respect as much. Now, there are a few reasons for that. I can kind of go into them a bit more. But ultimately, when your social status is in a much more weak position, like it can kind of change very quickly, like say being a journalist, being an NGO worker. I mean, for example, if the country was to turn more right wing, right, which it is, you could be like a middle class Fintan O'Toole intellectual type, right, writing for the Irish Times, And if the country becomes more conservative right wing, going to respect a Finn O'Toole as much. You see what I mean? And so what's kind of happening in this sort of messed up kind of way is that these people don't like that. Like losing social status is extremely painful, right? You lose money, you lose access to resources, you lose respect, all that kind of thing, right? And so what's kind of going on there, I think, is ultimately like the Charlie Kirk thing is kind of like this really messed up manifestation of that. So basically, like you've got this right wing commentator, you've got Trump, the country seems to be going more and more right wing. You're getting kind of worried and uncomfortable, and you dislike this. And then this event happens, and then in a messed up way, it's basically kind of you going or them going, hey, the right wing is kind of like the evil right wing have lost, they've lost on this, right? They've lost out. And when you're in that kind of position whereby, you're losing out in social status, right? You how do you get it back? Well, I mean, one of the ways you can get it back is, well, what if the whole system was to become more authoritarian? What if the whole system was becoming more based on, misinformation, disinformation, a new one they have, which is really creepy, malinformation, right? And you're allowed to kind of like shut down and shut out your competitors, right? If you're able to do that, and you're doing it by force, admittedly, you still have a higher level of social status, or your social status is not falling as much, right? If you're a journalist writing for the journal.ie or whatever, and everything else, all your competitors have been branded as misinformation, right? To a certain percentage of people, you have a monopoly based on that. Well, you have a monopoly basically, and therefore your kind of social status holds up. And that's one of the reasons I think, for example, why, when you go back to 2016, the Trump and Brexit, and then after that, like, you had all the kind of like, for example, on YouTube, if anyone remembers it, you had all these different accounts and different YouTube channels being banned kind of left, right, and center. That's why that kind of started to speed up, because that was kind of the first set of signals that there was a counterbalance, that there was a response to what was going on in our societies, that everything was drifting left, right? So that this whole kind of Charlie Kirk thing is based on that. It's based on, I think, essentially like this group of people that's disproportionately coming up any time that comes up like this. It's basically people whose social status is massively tied up with the system, and that's in a major way. For example, this, or for example, things like Dublin 4, right? That's one of the examples, or one of the reasons why Ireland is becoming more and more authoritarian, right? Because you've got this cohort of people who are progressively starting to lose out on social status and respect given to them. And this kind of results in them wanting, on kind of an intrinsic level, to become more authoritarian, to crave authoritarianism. I think that is actually a major reason why that's happening. And it does, what I've kind of said here, it does have predictive power. I mean, it, like, even talk about recently, like the whole the whole thing with the flags, right? Um, this whole thing that, like, oh no, yeah, the waving of the Irish flag can be seen as, you know, intimidation, and all this kind of silliness, like, um, and we can't let, what was Simon Harris's comment, something about like we can't let our flag be captured by hate. And it's just like, it's your national symbol, it's a flag, right? And it's just, when you kind of take a look at it, you're kind of going like, what the hell, this doesn't make any sense. But when you kind of dive into it, it actually kind of does. Because again, if you take a look at, I would say, like, what the Irish ruling class, because I titled this video "The Irish Ruling Class" and Charlie Kirk, right? What has happened with the Irish ruling class over the past like couple of decades is, and I've kind of referenced this a bit back and forth before in a couple of previous streams. This idea, there's a book by a guy called Charles Murray called "Coming Apart," right? and he talks about like how ultimately, like in America, but I think the same thing has happened in Ireland. Basically, through the university system, and basically through a very merit based system, right? That has built out over time. You've ended up building up kind of clusters of elites and ruling class and talent within, like within America, his example, but in the Irish example, Dublin Four, right? And we all know Dublin Four, like all the jokes like Russell, Carol Kelly, and all that kind of stuff, right? And one of the consequences of this, like Murray argues in his book, and I think we can see the same thing in Ireland, for example, is that these people are becoming increasingly isolated. They're becoming increasingly isolated and divided from the rest of the country. And they both either don't know what's going on, and even to a certain extent, they don't appreciate what's going on, or even don't care. They don't care. I mean, like when I did a stream kind of stuff back at the start of the year, and I was talking about like Stormy Owen, right? And a big chunk of that stream, I was talking about like the power stuff and the energy grid and Sitka Spruce and all that kind of thing, right? But another part of it, I remember at the time there was a Six Nations rugby match, right? And Ireland had won, and I was just there kind of going like, Jesus Christ, half the fucking country is still without power, right? And there's no mention of that. There was more talk in this kind of area of the country, in these social circles, of the actual rugby match rather than the actual power being out, which was absolutely batshit insane. And that's ultimately kind of led into this, because we've built up this kind of Irish ruling class, in my opinion, who has become, in this way, quite stagnant and unable to appreciate and unable to look into what is kind of going on and what is floating around right now. So, like I was talking about before, the different levels of response. The first level is someone stupidly, disgustingly saying, "Oh, it's great what happened," and then the next level above that is, "Well, it's bad that it happened to Charlie Kirk, but he was a white supremacist, so who cares, right?" And then the next level is about, "Yeah, we condemn the violence and whatnot. Now let's just kind of bring it back to Irish politics, right?" And that kind of it just feeds into all of this. So when that kind of social status box or thing is ticked off, right? That is what is driving this behavior. So here's the framework. Here's the framework, right? It's something along the lines of this. An event comes along, and that event will either boost your social status or bring down your social status, right? Events that bring up your social status, you support, and events that bring down your social status, you condemn, right? And because a big chunk of the Irish ruling class are in this kind of this combination of a bubble plus this combination of lower social status, um, which is more vulnerable in certain ways, a journalist, right? That ends up being a sort of a toxic combination whereby these people end up increasingly supporting authoritarian methods while at the same time, um, sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. While at the same time celebrating anything that kind of goes in their favor. So, not sure. Tom says, not sure. I saw refugees bin people looking for plastic bottles in Black Rock the other day. Refugees bin people. Oh, okay, yeah. No. Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. But yeah, I suppose that's kind of where this whole thing is. But again, just to kind of go back to the framework, right? If I like this event, even the kind of thing that I've kind of described, it feeds into like even government policy and the way the government is kind of approaching other things. So, for example, like with the presidential election, right? And I'll move into the presidential election a bit for a second. Allow me to digression a bit. My reading of the presidential election was something along the lines of this, or the reading is something along the lines of this, right? based on, if you go back, right, or if you go back to a lot of presidential elections, right, Irish people are more happy to kind of like vote for kind of like a random mad kind of outsider candidate. Like there's usually kind of like a, you know, RTE Montrose approved candidate, right? Typically. But at the same time, uh, there's usually kind of like a guy who's not supposed to be there, but will do disproportionately well. So actually, Mary Robinson was a bit like that in 1990. Um, if you remember Sean Gallagher in 2011, he was poised to win it until the frontline appearance, right? In 2018, Peter Casey was on 1%, and then he turns up on the radio, talks about Travellers for a bit, and then he ends up on 20%. Like Irish politics and Irish voting patterns tend to be very, very stable in general. Irish people tend to be very stable in terms of voters. Like, we're not like Italy, or Italy or Latin America, where we'll vote a communist in one term and then we'll vote in a you know anarcho-libertarian, as in the case in Argentina, the next. We don't do that, right? We're very kind of stable in terms of like voting, but the presidential elections are not like that as much. So what I think has happened is they know this and they've been talking about it, and they've been kind of going like, oh shit, um, if this goes in the wrong direction, and because more and more people are getting angry and upset, and things are getting worse in relation to like cost of living and all this kind of stuff, that if a Conor McGregor, or if any kind of outsider candidate gets on the ticket, this could kind of go in one direction very quickly. So what do we need to do? We need to do two or three things, right? We need to make sure that that outsider candidate does not happen. It can't be allowed to happen. Shut everything down. Shut it down as much as possible. Then you see Simon Harris kind of turning around to his party and saying, like, Fine Gael candidates are only allowed to vote in a certain way. Although, interestingly enough, a bunch of councillors for Tipperary County Council kind of rebelled against that. But anyway, I'm going off the point. And then the idea then is to just have a nice, boring output whereby there's a low voter turnout, boomers turn up, and they vote in, say, Heather Humphreys, right? And that, like, basically what I'm trying to say is that, like, if you had a Conor McGregor get in, or if you had someone like that in, because think about it this way, right? The past 3 or 4 Irish presidents, two things about the Irish presidency. One of them is that, again, I remember just talking to kind of older people about this, that like prior to Mary Robinson, the presidency was almost kind of seen as a bit like, basically a Fine Gael retirement package, right? It wasn't seen as, a Fianna Fáil retirement much, or it wasn't kind of taken as seriously. Like, the whole idea of like, oh, we've got like, he was a good president or she was a good president, wasn't really as much of a thing prior to Mary Robinson coming in 1990, right? And, think about it from the social status point of view. So, like, we've had Mary Robinson, Mary McAleese, and Michael D. Higgins, right? And essentially, all three of them have been essentially, very left-wing, leftist academic people, like activist people as well, right? If you had, say, Conor McGregor get in, right? I'll talk about kind of the candidates and whatnot in a bit too, but it would be such a symbolic change, and it would be kind of like such a, not to rattle on about like boring psychology terms, but this whole thing, like, the collective unconscious, Jung and whatnot, right? It would be such a signal to everyone. It would be such a kind of a manifestation of change, right? That these people, like, whose social status is more fragile, like I was talking before, it would be such a hit to them. So their only kind of hope there is to essentially become more and more authoritarian, right? So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by this framework I'm talking about with the social status stuff does predict an awful lot what's going on. And it does predict in terms of like, the Charlie Kirk stuff. China is more democratic than here. It's a joke country. Harris is a cartoon character. A tipping point will come. And yeah, and then Saints and Scholars says people of any moderate political side are absolutely horrified. Two little babies left without a father. Lorna O'Brien can't empathize as a parent, yet claims to have spiritual insight. Oh, Laura O'Brien is the yeah, I saw the clip of her. She was like part of like the Irish Pagan Society. Is that the one? I might be mixing that up. Like I've seen so many of these clips and all this kind of stuff. There was another one, a UCD professor who was putting out kind of similarly, you know, um, you know, not tweets, but kind of blue sky messages of similar content. I'll have to look her up again in the next bit, but it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, and the thing is, like, I don't know. I mean, my kind of attitude to it is like, I mean, myself, right? I'm obviously I'm like a micro version of a micro version of a micro version of Charlie Kirk, but at the same time, like, one of the things we did have in common uh was that, like, I mean, we do, or in Charlie's case did do right wing ish or right wing political, talking, or just talking about stuff, you know what I mean? And, you know, if someone like Charlie Kirk, if it's okay to celebrate him, then, what about someone like me who just kind of dicks around and, has this as a little bit of a hobby, right? Like, it's fucking crazy. Like, that's a very kind of, disconcerting thing. And, the way that it's been kind of used as well. I mean, I'll read out a bit of it here. I'm not going to share my screen because, like, just this kind of new setup that I have. But there's an Irish Times article, right? You might have seen this. I mean, Gerard was talking about this a couple of streams ago. But you know, here's the headline, right? Uh, and this is the Irish Times, and so I'm quoting just what they said here. Charlie Kirk, in his own words, prowling blacks and his views on gun control. The far right commentator pulls no punches when discussing his bigoted views on current events. I mean, wow, like, I mean, this is such a nasty thing to do. I mean, like, this, there's nothing about the two little girl, his beautiful family, the two kids, nothing about that, or nothing about, I mean, what his parents are thinking, or nothing about, you know, you don't know who Charlie Kirk is. Well, here are his political opinions. Here's what he said on X. Very kind of clean, objective. Here's what he thinks on this, this, this. Here's who he was. Nothing like that. Like, you can read this article, right? And it's just smear after smear after smear. There's no attempt to kind of like understand who he was, what he wasn't, what his flaws were, how his views changed over time. There's nothing like that. There's no, like, here's another paragraph from this, right? Accountable to no one but his audience, he did not shy away in his rhetoric from bigotry, intolerance, exclusion, and stereotyping. You can kind of see what's going on here. Like, it's just kind of like, you know, it's just prodding and poking and just kind of going implicitly like, well, this is bad, but, we need to talk. But he was a bigot after all. He was a racist after all. Absolutely insanity. Like, absolute fucking insanity. Tom says, who'll fund all these public service malcontents with their luxury beliefs when the US companies go home? At some level, this is the triggering we're seeing in the Irish leftists. They know the game is over. Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of interesting stuff with that. I mean, and it kind of goes into kind of a couple of other points I was kind of like thinking about there. So, for example, like, we can talk about AI, right? Now, I mean, like, I've kind of started looking and reading more into AI for the past bit, and up until like the last kind of couple of months or few months, my kind of opinion on AI has been kind of like, oh, it's just a kind of a faster, fancier version of like a Google search engine, right? But I've kind of started like, I'll give an example, right? I was thinking of, I'm putting together like a little bit of a mini presentation. I might do a stream on it on Ireland's energy grid and the energy sector, and what would be kind of good ideas or good plans to kind of maybe put forward in terms of Irish energy security and things like that. Because one of the things with Irish energy, it blows my mind that it's happened, is that if you go back to, say, I'll give two examples, right? Do you remember back in February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine and the preceding months after that? And if you go back to, say, if you type in European gas prices, right? We remember back then, like, remember the petrol prices, they were just skyrocketing week after week after week, and it was going, it really did feel like, things were getting kind of like crazy in the energy market for a bit, right? Now obviously they calmed down and Europe was able to restructure um its energy kind of needs and requirements, but ultimately, like, with such an energy shock, you would think that the response here, especially with things like, gas from carb kind of running out and all that kind of stuff, you would think the response would be, oh, let's let's put out licenses for, Barry Rowe and things like that, or let's take a look at, like, increasing energy, right? And what did they do? Green Party shut down Shannon Bridge, shut down Lanesborough. I mean, they did this a bit before. They shut down production of LNG terminal with the United States, and they shut down any excavation work that could be done with things like Barry Rowe, especially as we're running out of gas off the west coast, right? And then you've got Stormy Owen. Stormy Owen comes along and it wrecks the energy grid, and there are places in Ireland which are out without power for like more than a week, right? And then there's stuff like, the Sitka spruce stuff, and I covered this before, like, electrical poles being blown over and all this kind of thing, right? All of that happens, and again, nothing, no response, no response in terms of like tightening up on energy and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, that was a bit of a rant, but like, just to tie that back to the AI thing, I've been kind of just kind of like really kind of reading into that, and the AI, like, some of the AI stuff has been incredibly interesting and helpful and useful. And just to kind of really just wrap this back with your point there about, like, malcontents with luxury beliefs, right? Here's the thing. If AI is getting powerful enough now that a lot of entry level jobs are going, here's the thing though. Where are those entry level jobs going from? Are they going from the public sector or are they going from the private sector, right? They're obviously going to be coming disproportionately from the private sector. Do you think that they are going to start cutting civil servants and firing civil servants and replacing civil servants with AI in the same way that it might happen in the private sector? Excuse me. No, that's not going to happen. And because a major kind of like part of how Ireland is run, the civil service and whatnot, won't want to lose their status and won't want to lose their power, that's where you're going to have an interesting effect. Because what's happening now within the job market, especially among kind of entry level, certain white collar jobs. I mean, I've heard this especially with things like, accounting. Accounting's in trouble. Like, some of the kind of earlier, more basic stuff can easily just be done by an AI, right? Or like someone can kind of just use an AI in tandem with their own work, things like that, right? What's kind of coming down the line now is I could see an impact now, an effect whereby you have more disillusioned, disenfranchised younger people, but at the same time, you've got this kind of civil service kind of cohort of people who will try and just like protect themselves and protect the money and protect their status, right? So, when you kind of say that, like, who will fund all these people, they'll try and keep themselves kind of afloat and up and running first, right? You know, and but if that was to happen as well, yeah, that's where kind of like the triggering comes from, and that's where you're seeing this stuff. Even new terms. I mean, like I said before, there must be some guy in some consulting firm who came up with the term malinformation. And I remember watching that clip, right? Grip.ie and Ben Scallon kind of put it out, like, filmed that. There's a Fine Gael guy who was talking about this term malinformation, right? Malinformation, all this stuff, saying that like again and again and again and again. AI is not replacing jobs; it's slop. AI is cover for outsourcing to out Ed Zitron's podcast. Okay, yeah, I'll take a look at that. Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, if that is the case or not, like it is certainly the case that and I've kind of heard of that, like entry level ads like are having a much harder time, and there has been kind of discussion in companies on like being able to replace certain things with AI. But yeah, I'll take a look at that. But I guess my kind of main point is that you're going to have this kind of like sort of rubber band effect between those in the public sector and those within the private sector. But ultimately, again, just to kind of wrap this back to the kind of presidency stuff, and then we'll kind of, once I kind of finish my main point with that, I can bring that back to some of the Charlie Kirk stuff, and then we can kind of like conclude the whole thing. So yeah, just on that kind of point with the presidency stuff. So basically, yeah, they wanted like, and what they want is, they ultimately want to kind of like keep the whole shop going, keep everything running, kick the can down the road, keep things kind of ticking over and clocking over just fine, right? So low voter participation, low turnout, people being kind of depoliticized, demoralized, and then you have boomer candidate A, and then boomer candidate B, and then left wing boomer candidate C. Whatever flavor of boomer that you want, and that's your president, right? Now, the interesting thing about Maria Steen is that there have been kind of articles and things like that in the Irish Times starting to promote her, which is certainly kind of interesting. I think I might know what's going on there a bit, but ultimately, I don't. Even Maria Steen, I think she needs like fucking 12 members of the upper and lower houses kind of left if she wants to get on the ticket. But that's kind of what it's turned into, and that's kind of like what I would say is almost like the flavor or the framework of kind of Irish politics kind of going forward. It's going to be a mix of this kind of stuff, kind of depoliticize, keep out people that you don't like, and rely on the kind of older person boomer vote to get you in, basically. So that's what that kind of wraps into. And again, maybe just kind of on a side note, like, because I've heard a bunch of different arguments on the presidency. I mean, maybe the presidential race stuff, she's short 4 votes at the moment. I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was like she got 10, and then 2 of them pulled out. I think McDowell pulled out, and then she stuck with like 8 members of the Shand and the Oireachtas. But yeah, I haven't kind of read up on that. Yeah, maybe that's changed. But yeah, so yeah, just going back to my point, like on kind of just talking about the presidential race and kind of what it is and what it should be. I know this is not necessarily kind of like talking about Charlie Kirk or whatever, but I do think it's kind of relevant. I'll tie it back. But basically, what is the presidential race like in a sense? Like, what is the president supposed to be, right? In a sense, the president is supposed to be like this sort of, I would say like, I would say like, like what do you, again, just going back to my previous points, like, it's turned sort of into a symbol of where the country is, like, and then you've had like these 3 left-wing leftist activist presidents, right? Essentially. So let's kind of work through like what would be the kind of like, and let's just assume that like what's there right now is what's going to be there. I know that's not the most accurate assumption. Sinn Féin still have to announce a candidate, and all of that. And then there's a whole kind of like Maria Steen, Delahanty, McGregor thing. But I'm just going to work off the assumption like things kind of stay as they are for now, right? So we've got 3 candidates. They're all kind of terrible. There was something kind of floating around that Sinn Féin were going to run someone, um, and who Sinn Féin were going to run, um, obviously that's not been announced yet. But ultimately, like, yeah, the three candidates, right? The three candidates, right? So, we've got maybe like 4 or 5 options, I would say, even though there's three candidates. Number one is that you just don't turn up and vote. That's, like I was kind of saying before, that's to a degree what they want. So I would say that, like, don't do that. Um, Other people were talking about kind of spoiling the voting in protest, and I get it, but that still doesn't like help push things in terms of, like, which one of the three is the best for just Ireland or symbolically or the country, right? So I don't really agree with that option either. So out of the remaining three, we've got Heather Humphreys, um, and Heather Humphreys is, she's a Fine Gael boomer, like a typical Fine Gael politician, you know. And the thing is with Humphreys as well, like, I was talking earlier about before, there was kind of a chosen establishment candidate and a sort of a slightly outsider candidate, right? Humphreys is the chosen candidate, so that's a bad decision. She'd be a bad person to get that job. Jim Gavin, I mean, like, it would be nice to have. I mean, the thing is with Jim Gavin, he's obviously this, like, this kind of gray man in a sense, just this kind of like tries to appeal to everybody. There's this whole thing about him supporting Fine Gael, so you're voting for Fine Gael again, in a sense. Um, the only thing about him though is that, the guy is, despite all the kind of Gombeen stuff around that, he is kind of an impressive guy, right? I don't want to vote for him at all. I'll get into the last candidate there in a second, and I wouldn't vote for him, or I disagree with that. I disagree with him being president, like, But, you know, like I said, after three left wing activists who have just kind of like, you know, been in the public sector almost all their lives, and from a president who was, you know, celebrating communist dictators, to have a guy who's actually achieved impressive things in his life to a degree, that would be an improvement, Not much of one, a lousy one, but that would be an improvement. And then finally you get to Catherine Connolly, who's another, you know, leftist activist, president or politician. However, with her, two things, right? First of all, back during the lockdown, she actually opposed some of it. She actually was against some of the lockdown stuff. And I was just kind of thinking that, like, when Michael D. Higgins signed that instrument, that piece of legislation into law discriminating against people who didn't take the vaccine. Imagine if you had a president who kind of just said, "Nah, this is kind of nonsense. I don't want to do this," or, you know, spoke out against it a little bit. I mean, and then the other thing with Catherine Connolly as well is, she did speak out against the kind of like, the whole, you see the whole thing with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael trying to, get rid of the triple lock thing. And she kind of spoke out against that as well. So on a couple of issues like that, she's actually been pretty good, but at the same time, she's obviously, I disagree with her and like 99% of things, and Labour left-wing activist politician. So I don't know. I think they're all like pretty lousy choices, but I'm kind of, you know, I'd be interested to see what other people think, but I'm kind of more like, she's probably the best choice on the account of, like, she actually disagreed on a couple of really good issues that are really important. But at the same time, they're, and again, like I said, with a lot of this stuff, it's kind of like, if you're in a bad situation, just pick the least worst option, and out of those three, she probably might be the least worst. right? So yeah. Um, the other thing as well I wanted to talk about there in relation to that. So the next question then is who is actually going to win it, right? So let me just yeah, my charge is about to run out there. So let me just give me 10 seconds there and I'll be back in a bit, yeah? So 1 second. Hope you're still here. Um, Bit of a gonzo operation, but hold on. Right, we're good. Crisis averted. Power, my power was down at like 2%. So yeah, I got it in just in time. Yeah, so has Nick Delahanty got the necessary backing yet? No, he hasn't. He needs 4 councils out of the 30, but no, he hasn't got any backing yet. Out of all the like the independents that are left, like they still need to get 4 councils or 20 members of the upper and lower houses, and there's no kind of like thing that they'll actually kind of come close to getting that. And obviously, like there was this kind of thing floating around there that Sinn Féin might run Michelle O'Neill, right? That's going to be announced over the next few days. But ultimately, back to my point, and kind of like who I think is going to win it. As of now, I think the average Irish person is just going to look around and go, because the thing is like that, even to kind of break that down further, right? In terms of like Irish society right now, you can almost break down Irish society into like 3 groups, right? People who are kind of doing pretty well, quite well. People who are doing kind of neutral, plodding along. I'm comparing like this to pre-lockdown 2019 era, and then the last group of people, about 1/3 of the population, are like doing noticeably worse, and I've been doing noticeably worse for quite some time, right? And they're gonna like, in terms of that kind of angry outsider vote, right? Because they've kind of kept out genuine outsider candidates. The only one who's a little bit like that is Catherine Connolly. And the thing is, and this Charlie Kirk thing is just going to add to this, and this is the main point I wanted to add back on with the presidential stuff and Charlie Kirk, is that kind of form of leftism, right? You're kind of like NGO, trans rights or human rights, people before profit, Paul Murphy kind of guy. That kind of leftism is past its inflection point. It's definitely on the way down to some degree. Now, how fast is that going to be? I don't know, but it is that kind of stuff is definitely being kind of decreasing, and it's kind of being swallowed up in certain ways by like other forms of leftism. We can talk about the Social Democrats if you want, but that's kind of another thing. But the thing is, like, the sort of outsider vote or the kind of outsider rebellion vote is not only not catered for with her, it's not really it doesn't really appeal to people. So between all of this, I think the average Irish person is just going to look around and he's going to go, one of them is a Fine Gael candidate. I don't want to go near her because of Simon Harris, and the scoliosis thing. One of them is a left wing, mad person, and one of them is a normal GAA guy who I could see myself having a few pints with down the pub. So I'm going to go with Gavin. So I think as of things now, as things stand right now, it probably will be Gavin unless there's some miracle with Delahanty or McGregor or Steen or something like that, or anything like that. So I really don't believe Delahanty will get on the ballot. I don't think he will either, to be honest with you. I can't see the route, like, especially now that Fine Gael have kind of come down and tried to ban like their own councillors from speaking about that. So AI not coming from my job in teaching, doesn't do a tap of housework or change a nappy. But yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing too, like with AI. Like AI, as far as I kind of understand it, like, if you've got a job which is very like sort of, I don't know, like in and you do something and out, that's the stuff that's kind of more in danger. So for example, one of the ways that kind of jobs are being wiped out, one kind of job that's being wiped out is kind of like increasingly, like, even stuff like certain banks and certain organizations are starting to do this, is like, customer call centers, right? Because like, you might have something wrong with your fridge, but there's only like 10 different ways maybe something might be wrong with your fridge. And so that stuff can be like relatively easily automated and fixed up, right? Maria Steen has a real chance. She's imperfect, but she's our best hope from an anti-Dublin 4 point of view. She's really cool, actually. Like, she was great. She was fantastic last year during the referendums. And, that whole thing on like her and prime time with like Micheál Martin. And she comes across as just likable and normal and all those kind of things. And she does share a bunch of opinions, with us and all that kind of stuff, which is great. The only thing with her, though, is that with the whole Iona Institute stuff, how they're going to play this. They're kind of going to go and, they're going to push the kind of like abortion stuff and whatnot on top of her. And they're going to try and do a kind of she's a ultra Catholic, crazy person, right? And, and I think that could be kind of quite effective in terms of like influencing a lot of Irish people. And then the other thing too is that like that outsider vote, like how good would she be at like just getting disenfranchised, like demoralized people off the couch to kind of vote for her? It would be, I think she'd do very, very well, like if she kind of got on. But I mean, that's the other thing too, like the whole kind of media system will kind of come down on top of her as well. And they'll kind of work in terms of kind of protecting and trying to get their own candidate in. Excuse me. I mean, for example, even stuff like, all these kind of articles about Catherine Connolly talking about like, we need to talk about Catherine Connolly and how she, gave Gemma O'Doherty a nomination 8-9 years ago. I mean, it's like, well, yeah, sorry, 7. I mean, for fuck's sake, like, I mean, that's real kind of like bottom of the barrel stuff that's, going on right now. So yeah, no, but I it'll be great if she got on. It'd be great to have someone to rally around because, right now, my opinion is that like Connolly is probably the best out of those 3, but it's like, it's such a low bar, like, But I think that's the kind of a way of thinking about it, like in terms of like symbols and in terms of social status, like, what can be done to kind of like elevate, right-wing nationalist people. And, anything that kind of gets us closer to that, including someone who will talk about 1 or 2 very important points. I mean, like I said, being an Irish politician who talked about the lockdown or some parts of the lockdown being bad, I mean, that's pretty rare, and that is commendable to some degree. So maybe I'm just biased with the lockdown stuff because, the Charlie Kirk stuff has brought back some of those memories, and how crazy that was. And it was crazy here, right? I mean, I have a buddy in in Sweden, right? And he was basically just talking about like, when the vaccines kind of came out, it was much more like, it is more like, if you want to take it, fine. If you don't want to take it, whatever, you probably should. It was much more kind of laid back in a sense. Whereas here, like it was just like, it was vicious here, like, and that hasn't been forgotten. It's like that whole thing after the lockdowns were lifted, like in 2022, it was almost kind of like things just reset, right? It was just like, do you remember any of the past 2 years and actually what happened there? It is like some kind of like, you know, some kind of like, I don't know. You watch one of these kind of US comedies and there's kind of like a cringe moment, like, and everyone just kind of forgets that it happened. We're not going to talk about that anymore, that kind of stuff, right? It's, it's utterly ridiculous, the whole thing. And that'll happen with this as well, this Kirk thing. Now, the Kirk thing has built up a lot of energy and we're right in the middle of it. I mean, there's these big protests or this set of protests going on in Britain for the past while or earlier today. I mean, there are some numbers. I haven't looked into this, but like, a couple of million people turned out in the streets, which is massive. And that's the thing as well, because if depending on where this Kirk thing goes, I mean, we're in the middle of it right now. If it kind of fizzles out or if it doesn't fizzle out, but certainly within the Irish context, right? It's it's going to bother them, and you're probably going to see more kind of like strange or odd things. I mean, for example, like I wouldn't be surprised now, like I'm half joking, but honestly, half if you had something like the classic chicken fillet roll is now an example of far right racism, like stuff like that. Um, any kind of little thing, any kind of symbol of a kind of a social status or a social club that kind of belongs outside, the main Irish system or the Dublin Four system or whatever you want to call it, um, is not going to be kind of good for them, or that's not going to be something they're going to, you know, approach with any kind of sane metric or kind of sane value, right? And that just leads into the entire like state of Ireland right now, and things becoming increasingly bewildered and confounded and all this kind of thing. I mean, look at this, right? I mean, like just to even just finish off on that point, and I'll probably kind of end the stream now in the next bit because I mainly wanted to talk about the social status stuff. Um, I'll end on this, like, or I'll go into this kind of set of points. This kind of whole thing about like, we're heading into, for example, in I think October, right? October, like, we're going to have the budget and all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, there are so many kind of different metrics and different things that are kind of working in a certain direction. Like, I mean, for example, like the construction industry. I mean, I've talked about this before, is beginning to kind of like, I kind of made this prediction, I think back about a year and a half ago, that the construction industry is going to start like declining kind of pretty quickly. We've had like 3 or 4 months of the construction industry, according to various construction indices, kind of starting to contract, right? So you're going to start seeing stuff like that, and then I mean, people like that guy, Paul Trevald, talking about like how the rest of the industry, and you can see this like walking around so many Irish towns, like how a lot of this stuff has just basically started to implode, right? And then they're talking about stuff like budget deficits, and Gerard was mentioning this as well. They had a Department of Finance report talking about like the impact of like increased population growth and mass immigration coming into the country over the next like coming decades and things like that. And Gerard mentioned it in the stream that like he had a kind of a good description of it. Gerard Murphy, like he was talking about like they approach this as if it's like this force of nature that is just going to happen, and there's no kind of like, I mean, Denmark have done and released analyses and statistical analysis and papers on this. Holland have done the same thing. There's a United Kingdom uh, civil service think tank that did the same thing as well. That goes into this stuff that the economic contribution of mass immigration is questionable at best. All this kind of thing, but ultimately, it's just built around the fact that, like, you know, um, just tying back to kind of like back to all of this with the kind of social status stuff that ultimately you have had for the past while in the past few decades, this Dublin 4 elite, this enclosed elite, and they've been able to kind of like go through things kind of relatively unchallenged. I mean, there's a good Meon article and a Burkean article kind of talking about this point, this whole thing that, like, there was a bit of like, Desmond Fennell called it like, the nice people and the rednecks, right? The difference between kind of like Fine Gael and Gareth Fitzgerald and Charlie Haughey and the kind of voting base of Fianna Fáil at that time, right? That was kind of more like the last kind of back and forth before the, to use kind of Desmond Fennell's kind of words or phraseology, the Dublin 4 people took over, right? And that's why, like, for example, that's why, there is no opposition in this country, in a sense. Like, the opposition party, Sinn Féin, is not really an opposition party. There's no, like, even in like the United Kingdom, like you'll get stuff like the Guardian over here and then the Spectator over there, right? And there's nothing like that here. I mean, that's one of the kind of main reasons. But ultimately, what's happening is that kind of facade is starting to, well, among average people, they're starting to challenge it. So what's the response? We come up with terms with like malinformation. That one's really fucking crazy. So, but yeah, it's interesting times, but that's ultimately the main point where that's ultimately where all the kind of Charlie Kirk stuff kind of feeds into all of this, like, and it's interesting. It's okay, I'm sorry, just scanning the comments there. Where does this kind of all lead into, with this kind of thing? So, okay, sorry, I trailed off a bit there. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of it, really. Like, that's kind of it. So ultimately, just to kind of sum up this stream, Charlie Kirk, absolutely brutal and horrible what happened to him. A lot of this is being driven by people, I think, who are, and also, like, I forgot to mention this, but there's a lot of kind of like statistical data that goes into stuff like people who are very, very left wing have a higher out group bias compared to people who are less left wing or even right wing, right? So they kind of support other groups more than their own group, right? Which kind of makes sense, and if you're sort of like, a kind of a more bottom of the totem pole kind of lower status person, right? You're gonna kind of do anything you can to get your status up, right? I mean, that's the thing. Like, I mean, I've seen this so many times with a lot of people, or the people I've kind of known who are kind of, who call themselves like communists, right? A lot of those people are, and they're kind of like middle class people who kind of like, oh, we're for the working class and whatnot. But then you kind of look at them and you talk to them, and like they're kind of just like, they support the idea of like a big powerful communist state or whatever, not because they think it'll do good, but if you have a system like that, they imagine themselves like in the fucking Politburo drinking good wine, right? They don't imagine themselves in the mines or whatever, like, just to use a Soviet Union metaphor there. But yeah, it's really something. And if this kind of happens, what it's ultimately going to do, and along with other events like that, if they do happen, you're going to kind of see people kind of come out with this kind of like more ugly, unpleasant, awful opinions like the Charlie Kirk one. But also it's going to kind of feed into like any kind of challenge or threat or movement on kind of someone's social status. They're going to come down on it in a fairly kind of big way. And that's also kind of, for example, like to sum up more, That's why you're seeing stuff like them freaking out about, like, the flags and whatnot. The flags are an evil racist symbol now, really, like the Irish flag. Or we need to talk about how to use the Irish flag appropriately. I mean, the translation there is obviously, you know, you can you can use the Irish flag at, say, like some random music gig or football match, but you can't use it to kind of like just put outside your garden and go like, I'm an Irish person and I'm proud to be Irish. You can't do it like that anymore, apparently. So, anyway, I think we'll leave it there. It's getting kind of late enough, and I've kind of talked or kind of gone over my main points. Good stuff. I think we've had like about 15, 20 people listening in, so that's pretty cool. Uh, I don't really. Is there any kind of main comment there? Anyone kind of has left? I'll kind of read out. I've already kind of gone through my main points there. Oh yeah, and just to kind of just sum everything up, like I talked a bit about the kind of presidential election and kind of how I see that going. I mean, obviously the other thing with the presidential election is that that's very kind of volatile. So like like in 1919, like in 2011, that stuff kind of changes very very quickly. So the Jim Gavin prediction is much much weaker than it would be kind of for something else. And obviously, if like Michelle O'Neill or you know someone manages to make it on the ticket, that changes the whole thing. God, it'd be amazing if McGregor got on in certain ways, wouldn't it? But and yeah, like I was kind of referencing there, out of all the bad and awful options, you know, Connolly on the account she was against the lockdown and a few other things might be the best one, but obviously I'm open to a different opinion on that. And yeah, that was great, or that was kind of fun. And your man, who is it, Mark Brown, Ed Zitron, I'll take a listen to that as well, or I'll take a look at that. So cheers for the shout out. Okay, cool. Yeah, we really will shut it down. God bless you all. Cheers for that, Saints and Scholars. Have a good one, folks. Have a good rest of your week, and I'll speak to you later on. And I might do another one of these streams, but the next one I want to do is maybe of one or two topics. I might take a look. I might do one on Ireland's energy grid. That was one, and the other one I wanted to maybe take a look at was kind of a full blown one, kind of going into like the Irish economy and things like that. I mean, I already did some of the Irish economy stuff in bits and pieces before, but I kind of want to get into kind of it in bigger detail. But anyway, look, that's for another day. That's for another stream. That's for another time. That's for another weekend. So yeah, we'll leave it there. Have a good one, and yeah, nothing else to say, but goodbye.